I remember that night as if it were etched into my very soul, a bitter winter evening when the road ahead melted into a white abyss, and every gust of wind carried whispers from the past. It was supposed to be a simple drive home after a long week, but nothing in that frigid darkness could have prepared me for what lay ahead. The snowfall was relentless, each flake a tiny shard of ice that blurred the world outside my windshield. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I navigated the winding road, its curves swallowed by a curtain of snow. The silence was almost tangible, punctuated only by the hum of my engine and the occasional scrape of tires against ice. Yet, beneath that stillness, I sensed something amiss, a subtle shift, like a distant murmur that grew louder with each mile. At first, it was merely a trick of my mind. I'd always been prone to overthinking in these solitary moments. But as I drove deeper into the night, I began to notice peculiar details, a light flickering in the distance that didn't match any vehicle I knew, the static-laden hum of the radio that momentarily seemed to speak my name, and a shadow flitting just beyond the reach of my headlights. I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my eyes, yet my heart pounded with the certainty that I was not alone. I pulled over at a small turnout, hoping a moment of calm would clear my racing thoughts. Stepping out into the icy air, the cold bit into my skin, and the crunch of snow underfoot amplified the eerie quiet around me. I looked down the road, straining to catch a glimpse of the mysterious light. It danced among the trees, a fleeting glimmer that vanished as soon as I blinked. Uncertainty gnawed at me, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Back in my car, I tried to rationalize the phenomenon. Maybe it's just a car with a faulty bulb, I muttered to myself, but deep down, I felt a stirring of dread. The road seemed to stretch on infinitely, and every turn revealed more nothingness than answers. With the snow piling high against the windows, I could barely see the lane markings, and the GPS had suddenly gone dead, leaving me to rely solely on instinct and fading headlights. It wasn't long before I encountered something even stranger. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, my headlights caught sight of a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The figure was a woman in a long, flowing dress, her hair tangled by the wind, standing unnaturally still as if waiting for me. I rolled down the window and called out, "Are you okay?" But she didn't move. Instead, she stared directly at me, her eyes empty and distant. In that moment, an overwhelming sorrow, mixed with a profound terror, surged through me. I accelerated away, the image of her haunting my thoughts long after she vanished into the swirling snow. As I drove on, the feeling of being watched intensified. The isolated road began to feel like a stage set for something far darker than mere chance. I could swear I heard soft footsteps following my car, a rhythmic tapping that matched the beat of my heart. Every so often, I glanced at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that spectral woman again, yet there was never anyone there. The isolation was complete, and the only company I had was the ghostly echoes of my own anxiety. I soon came upon an old, run-down sign for Miller's Rest, a diner that seemed like an oasis on this barren stretch of road. With no other option in sight and my windshield wipers barely keeping pace with the storm, I decided to pull in. The diner looked like it had been abandoned for decades, its neon sign flickering weakly in the storm. I hesitated, but hunger and the need for shelter overpowered my reluctance. I stepped inside, the door creaking ominously behind me. The interior was a time capsule, dust-covered tables, faded photographs on the walls, and a sense of despair that hung in the air like a dense fog. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" but the only reply was the echo of my own voice. I settled into a booth and ordered a cup of coffee, though the menu was nearly illegible under layers of grime. The coffee tasted bitter and cold, and as I sipped it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. While I waited, I took out my phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal inside the building. It was then that I noticed a photograph on the wall, a family portrait of a man, a woman, and a young child, all wearing expressions that seemed to plead for salvation. The woman in the picture bore a striking resemblance to the figure I had seen on the road. A chill ran down my spine. Had I unknowingly crossed paths with a ghost? The idea was ludicrous, yet nothing about tonight made sense. Just as I was beginning to question my sanity, the diner's door swung open with a violent gust of wind. I looked up, and there, standing in the doorway, was an old man. His eyes were a piercing blue, and his face was lined with years of hardship. He approached me slowly, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling with urgency. "This place. It's a gateway." Before I could reply, he continued, "The snowy road darker. Many have driven down that road, never to return." His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt the diner's atmosphere shift from forlorn to sinister. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but before I could muster a question, he turned and walked out into the storm, leaving me with more questions than answers. Compelled by both dread and a desperate need to understand, I gathered my things and followed him out. The cold air was even more biting now, and the snow fell in a relentless, suffocating barrage. I spotted him at a distance, his silhouette barely visible against the white void. I called out, "Wait!" But he didn't stop. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching in the fresh snow, until I was close enough to see his eyes, so full of sorrow and regret that they seemed to mirror my own. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. He hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of his confession. "I was once like you, a traveler, lost on this road," he began, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I made a terrible mistake, and now I'm doomed to wander these desolate stretches forever. The spirit of the road. It hungers for souls who dare to defy its boundaries." I felt a knot of terror twist in my stomach. "What do you mean by the spirit of the road?" I pressed. Desperate for clarity, he sighed, a sound heavy with centuries of sorrow. "Long ago, before these roads were paved, this land was the site of unspeakable tragedies, a massacre, a betrayal, a curse that has haunted the snows ever since. The spirit is not human, it is a force of nature, born of pain and regret. It lures travelers with the promise of refuge, only to claim them when they least expect it." The wind howled as he spoke, as if echoing the lament of lost souls. I could see the fear in his eyes, and suddenly, every strange event of the night, the mysterious light, the ghostly figure, the sudden isolation, clicked into place. I was not merely experiencing an unusual night, I was ensnared in a supernatural trap set by a force beyond comprehension. Determined to uncover the truth, I followed him deeper into the storm, his frail form leading me down a side road that seemed even more desolate and treacherous than the one I had come by. The further we went, the more the surroundings transformed. The snow grew thicker, the trees more gnarled, and the silence became oppressive. Every step I took was accompanied by an ever-growing sense of dread. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me, and every shadow seemed to hide a lurking menace, after what felt like hours of trudging through the biting cold, we reached a clearing dominated by an ancient, decrepit mansion. Its architecture was out of place, ornate yet decaying, as if it were a relic from a forgotten era. The old man paused at the doorstep, his face etched with deep sorrow. "This is where it began," he said softly. "And where it all ends." I hesitated, caught between the urge to flee and an unyielding need to know more. The mansion's door creaked open on its own, inviting me into the darkness within. Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of decay and the ghost of memories long past. Dim light filtered through dusty windows, casting eerie patterns on the floor. Every creak of the ancient wood seemed to whisper warnings. I ventured further into the mansion, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. The halls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes following me with an unsettling intensity. I felt as though I had crossed a threshold into a different realm, a place where time had frozen and the souls of the departed were trapped in perpetual torment. In one room, I found a journal resting atop a cracked wooden desk. The pages were yellowed with age, and the entries recounted a harrowing tale of betrayal and sorrow. As I read, I discovered that the mansion had once belonged to a family torn apart by greed and vengeance. A great tragedy had unfolded on that very snowy road, and the resulting curse had seeped into the very fabric of the land. The journal hinted at a ritual, a desperate attempt to appease the restless spirit, but it ended abruptly, the final entry trailing off into a scrawl of terrified ramblings. I was so absorbed in the journal that I nearly missed the sound behind me, a soft, deliberate shuffle that sent a chill down my spine. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the woman from the snowy road. Her eyes, now clear and filled with unspeakable grief, met mine. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice a ghostly echo. "This curse, it's taken so many already." Before I could respond, the room plunged into darkness. The lights flickered and died, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence and the sound of my own pounding heart. I fumbled for my phone, its weak glow barely illuminating the immediate vicinity. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized that I was trapped in a labyrinth of despair and spectral torment. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as I wandered through the maze-like corridors of the mansion. Each room revealed more fragments of a story I could scarcely comprehend, a story of lost love, treachery, and the insatiable hunger of the cursed spirit that haunted the snowy road. Every door I opened whispered secrets, every creaking floorboard echoed with the agony of souls long past. I could feel the presence of the spirit, a cold and relentless force that seemed to follow me, to watch me, to torment me at every turn. At one point, I stumbled upon a room filled with mirrors, each one reflecting not just my physical form but flashes of a life I didn't remember. I saw images of a younger me, happier and unburdened, alongside horrifying visions of death and destruction on that very road. The mirrors shattered one by one, each break sending a cascade of jagged reflections across the floor, as if to signal the fracturing of reality itself. The realization hit me with the force of 1,000 winter storms. I was not just an unlucky traveler caught in a supernatural nightmare, I was part of it. The road, the mansion, the specters, they were all tied to me in a way I couldn't yet fathom. The mansion began to unravel around me. Walls bled with dark, viscous liquid, and whispers filled every corner, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair. I felt myself being drawn to a grand staircase that led down into an even deeper darkness. With each step, the air grew colder, the whispers louder, until I reached a door marked with a symbol I recognized from the journal, a symbol of binding, of eternal sorrow. Trembling, I pushed the door open. Inside was a cavernous chamber, its center dominated by an altar stained with what I hoped was only old blood. Candles flickered in a circle around the altar, their flames dancing in the draft of unseen presences. It was here, I realized, that the curse had been sealed, or perhaps, where it had been unleashed. I felt the pull of the altar, an irresistible force that beckoned me closer. As I stepped forward, memories flooded back, a long-forgotten accident, moment of guilt, the weight of decisions that had set this entire chain of events into motion. I had been involved, somehow, in the tragedy that had cursed this land. The horrifying truth began to dawn on me: I was not merely a victim of circumstance, but a catalyst in this endless cycle of torment. The altar pulsed as if alive, and I heard a soft, almost imperceptible murmur, like a heartbeat echoing in the silence. Suddenly, the room exploded in a blinding light. I was no longer in the cold, decaying mansion but standing on that very snowy road, as if I had been transported back to the beginning of the nightmare. The spectral woman appeared beside me, her expression both compassionate and sorrowful. "You must break the cycle," she said, her voice resonating with a power that shook the very ground beneath my feet. "Only by facing the truth of your past can you free us all." I tried to speak, to ask what she meant, but the wind carried away my words before they could form. The snowy road was no longer empty, it teemed with the phantoms of all those who had perished in the curse, their eyes pleading for redemption. I saw their faces, twisted in anguish and despair, and I knew that my fate was entwined with theirs. The realization was a crushing weight on my chest: I had been chosen, or perhaps cursed, to atone for sins I barely remembered committing. With a resolve I didn't know I possessed, I stepped forward, determined to confront the darkness that had haunted me for so long. The spectral voices grew louder, urging me to recall every detail, every decision that had led to this moment. As I closed my eyes, memories poured in: a heated argument on a snowy night, a tragic accident on that very road, the desperate attempts to cover up a mistake that had spiraled out of control. I had been complicit in something unspeakable, and now the spirits were calling me to justice, or perhaps, to damnation. In that moment, the snowy road transformed once again. I found myself back at the scene of the tragedy, a desolate stretch of highway, marked by the wreckage of a car and the remnants of lives shattered by a single, catastrophic event. The ghostly figures of the victims stood silent witness as I relived that fateful night. The realization hit me like an avalanche: the curse was not an external force, but the sum of all our regrets, a manifestation of collective guilt that had been passed down through generations. I was not alone in my burden. The road was haunted by the unresolved anguish of countless souls. As the spectral woman's voice echoed in my mind, I knew what had to be done. I gathered every ounce of strength and remorse, and with trembling hands, I reached out to the spirits. I spoke words of apology, of acceptance, and of a vow to make amends, even if it meant sacrificing everything I had left. In that act of contrition, the frozen nightmare began to thaw. The heavy blanket of snow that had obscured the path started to melt, and the ghostly figures slowly faded into the distance, their eyes softening with forgiveness. Yet, as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, a final twist revealed itself. I was left standing alone on the now quiet road, a lone figure in a world reborn. I realized with a sinking certainty that while I had released the spirits of the past, the burden of my own actions would forever remain. The snowy road, once a conduit of horror and despair, had transformed into a symbol of both redemption and eternal vigilance. I knew that I would never truly escape the memories of that night, for they were now woven into the very fabric of who I was. Driving home in the gentle light of dawn, the snow had ceased falling, leaving behind a pristine landscape that belied the darkness of the previous hours. My heart still pounded with the echoes of spectral voices and the weight of unresolved guilt, but with each passing mile, I felt a fragile hope emerging. The journey had been harrowing, filled with unpredictable twists and moments of sheer terror, yet it had also gifted me with a profound understanding of the human capacity for remorse and redemption. Even now, as I recount this tale, I am haunted by the memory of that snowy road, a road that will forever be etched in my mind as the threshold between the past and the possibility of forgiveness. I share this story not to scare, but to remind us all that sometimes the most horrifying journeys are the ones that force us to confront the deepest recesses of our own souls. And in doing so, perhaps we might find the strength to break free from the curses we carry, and finally, to begin healing. This is my truth, woven into the fabric of a night that seemed to stretch into eternity, where every turn on that snowy road echoed with whispers of the past. I hope you, too, find the courage to face your own darkness, even when the road ahead is shrouded in snow and shadows.